I'll need the pulpit mic. If Christ is not risen, your faith is futile, and you're still in your sins. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 17. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty serious statement. And I believe that it shows the centrality and the importance of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because essentially what Paul is saying there in verse 17, and really throughout the rest of the chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, is that if Jesus did not really rise from the dead as we claim that he did, if that claim, that historical claim is not true, then what you are doing, what we're doing here this evening, what we're trying to do with our lives is absolutely pointless. And so in that, Paul shows the importance of the resurrection of Jesus Christ to the life of the Christian. And that's why when individuals want to attack Christianity, when they want to dismiss Christianity and question the claims of Christianity, they go straight to the heart of Christianity and they attack the resurrection. They dismiss it as something fanciful, as something ludicrous, as something that a kid dreamed up. But in thinking of that, if someone came up to you and asked you, why do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Why do you believe that this man 2,000 years ago who claimed to be the Son of God actually did die and then was resurrected 3 days later? Could you in that moment give a reasonable answer as to why you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ? That's a thought that we want to pursue this evening as we continue a series that we started a couple of weeks ago titled Reasons to Believe. And tonight we want to look at reasons to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Of course, our key verse is 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 that we looked at several weeks ago, where Peter encourages us to be ready to give a defense, an apologia. We looked at that word there, where we get our word apologetics from, a defense of the reason for the hope that is within you. And at the center of that hope is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as we mentioned. Now, when we are looking at this question this evening, I do want you to realize that we are not looking at a question of science. We're not looking at a scientific question. This isn't a question that you can put in a test tube and test and have testing it over and over and over again, but rather it's a question of history. There are historical claims that are made about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so when we're looking at this historical claim, the question is it accurate? Is there enough proof? And so what we want to look at tonight is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the best explanation for that evidence. So we'll look at the evidence and the best explanation for that evidence. And what I think that you'll see at the end of this lesson is that there is so much evidence and proof for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is so historically viable that individuals who adamantly deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ are shown to simply have a bias against the supernatural. That is, they have a predisposed bias to reject anything that has to point toward or would point towards a supernatural being such as God. What then are some of the reasons and the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Well, as I mentioned, I want this to be a lesson in which you can easily discuss it with your friends, if needs be. Now, I realize that everything we talk about this evening, you're not going to be able to pull up off the top of your head. But I do hope to give you a way in which you can at least give a reason as to why you believe in the resurrection of the dead. And there's three particular line of evidences that we want to look at this evening in support of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. The three evidences are this: the empty tomb of Jesus Christ, the empty tomb. The second evidence is the post-death appearances, or we would say the post-mortem appearances, or we would say the resurrection appearances. You can use any of those. The resurrection appearances might be easiest when it comes to note-taking. And then the third evidence is the origin of the Christian belief. The origin of the Christian belief. And so if someone asks you, why you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you can say, well, I think that there are 3 lines of evidence, or I think there's 3 reasons as to why I believe that Jesus rose from the grave. Number 1, I believe there was an empty tomb. Number 2, I believe that Jesus appeared to several eyewitnesses. He had post-resurrection appearances. And number 3, the origin of the Christian faith. And I think that the best explanation for those 3 evidences is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So if you keep those 2 things in mind, evidence and explanation. What are the evidences? What's the best explanation for that evidence? That's how you approach a historical question. And that's how we're approaching it this evening. The first line of evidence that we want to look at for support of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the empty tomb, the historical claim of the empty tomb. Now, if you want to think of this in your mind as a drop-down menu, we're looking at the first evidence to support the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is an empty tomb. And then we kind of click on that. Now we have 5 evidences to support the empty tomb argument, if that makes sense. So 5 evidences to support the empty tomb of Jesus Christ, the historical reliability of the claim of the empty tomb of Jesus Christ. The first line of evidence supporting the empty tomb is the historical reliability of the burial of Jesus Christ. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, what in the world does the burial have to do with the empty tomb? How does the burial prove that the tomb of Jesus Christ was empty? Well, the reason that the burial and the historical reliability of the burial proves the empty tomb is that if the burial story of Jesus Christ being taken down from the cross and brought over to a tomb by a man, Joseph of Arimathea, if that burial narrative, that burial account is basically accurate, basically true, which if you look at it, we don't have time to look at it this evening, no one questions whether or not Jesus was buried, that he was died and buried. Even agnostic, atheistic scholars have to concede that Jesus was died, that he died, and that he was buried. So if that premise and that account is basically true, that Jesus died and was buried, which it is, then the tomb had to be empty. It had to be empty. Well, why is that? There's 3 reasons it had to be empty. Number 1, because if it wasn't empty, the disciples wouldn't have believed that Jesus rose from the grave. The disciples, after the death of Jesus Christ, are absolutely terrified. They had put their faith in a man who has now been crucified by the Romans and killed by the religious elite of their day. And there's absolutely no reason for the disciples to believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead if his tomb is right down the street. Unless that tomb was empty. So we know that he was buried, and all of a sudden we know that the disciples suddenly are claiming and believing that Jesus rose from the grave. And the only reason for them to believe that is if some reason they believe that that tomb is empty. And the second reason to believe that the tomb is empty because of the burial is because no one else would have believed the disciples. If the tomb was not empty, you have to remember that it is historically undeniable that Jesus Christ was crucified and buried. It's just, that is irrefutable. Okay? And not only was he crucified and buried, he was crucified and buried in a very public fashion in a very public city in Jerusalem. Okay? In a tomb from a very well-known man, Joseph of Arimathea. And so, if the disciples are going around saying, Jesus rose from the grave, he's not in the tomb, all they had to do was say, yeah, he is. His tomb's right there. His body is in the tomb. And so, the tomb had to be empty, otherwise anyone wouldn't believe him. Thirdly, this is a very good line of evidence as well. Once we realize that Jesus was buried, it shows that the tomb was empty, because if it wasn't empty, all the Jewish authorities had to do was to exhume the body of Christ to disprove the claims that the early church was making. The Jewish elite, and the Jewish religious elite, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were no fan of the, we'll talk about this a little bit later, were no fan of the disciples going around saying Jesus rose from the grave. Because that meant problems for them, because they crucified him. And they knew that Jesus had made claims that he was going to rise from the grave. And so if the disciples are going around and saying, Jesus rose from the grave, well, the authorities are going to do whatever they can to make sure that that claim does not spread, because it questions their power. And if Jesus was actually in the tomb, All they had to do was go and get the body and show it to the masses and disprove what the disciples were doing. And the fact that they did not do that, and the fact that Jesus was buried, shows us that the tomb was empty. Second line of evidence showing us that the tomb was empty is the independent reports of the empty tomb. Independent early reports of the empty tomb. Now, I know this is kind of hard for you to fathom, because when you look at the New Testament, you see a uniform collection of books. And we're blessed to have that. But sometimes we forget that these documents within the New Testament were not originally written that way. Someone did not sit down and write Matthew to Revelation. Every single one of these 27 books in the New Testament are independent documents that were written to a variety of different people that were later collected after they had circulated through the churches and shown to be the authority of the early church. But what that means is that all of these accounts within the New Testament are individual, independent accounts of whatever they are proclaiming. And they're historical documents, early historical documents. And this is a little bit off track, but not really. What we have in the New Testament, in the time period between the events that happened, that is the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the account of those events, the time period between when they happened and when they were recorded is unprecedented historically. There is such a narrow window of time. In fact, some of Mark's accounts and an excerpt from 1 Corinthians chapter 15 can be dated within 20 years of the events of Jesus. Now you might be thinking, wow, that's still some time. No, historically speaking, that is unprecedented to have such an early account from when the events actually happened and when they were recorded. And the reason that's important, as we'll talk about this a little bit later, is that there wasn't enough time for legends to occur. There wasn't enough time. Generally, it takes several generations for legends to occur, and you see that later on in what's called the apocryphal writings. You see these legendary writings about Jesus. But within the early accounts, we have independent accounts that testify to the empty tomb. For example, the Gospel of Mark is it is the earliest account of the empty tomb. And within Mark's Gospel, you have Mark, you have 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 5, which is dated to within, I believe, about 25 years of the event, which testifies to the empty tomb. You have Matthew's account, you have Luke's account, you have Peter's account in Acts chapter 2, recorded by Luke. These are independent historical proclamations to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's very important to show the empty tomb. The apologist William Lane Craig, he had this to say. He said, historians think that they have hit historical pay dirt when they have two independent accounts of the same event. What he means is that when historians are looking at a historical event and they can find two independent sources that testify to a single historical event, they think, man, we have got it. This is verified, right? But Craig goes on to say, but in the event of the empty tomb, we have no less than 6 independent eyewitness accounts, and some of these are among the earliest material to be found in the New Testament. And so we see that independent early accounts testify the empty tomb. Number 3, the simplicity of Mark's Gospel. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but this is a line of evidence for the empty tomb. The simplicity of Mark's Gospel. Mark's story of the empty tomb is so simple, it's so matter-of-factly, it lacks what's called legendary development. That means that it is not talking about a walking cross that is talking and declaring the glories of Jesus, which the later apocryphal Gospel of Peter does, which is a few hundred years after the events, a legend that later would come about. Mark doesn't have those type of telltale signs of a legendary account. He's very matter-of-factly, he's very simple, and it's early enough for these legends to be created. Very historical account. Fourthly, testifying to the evidence of the empty tomb, the women's discovery of the empty tomb. Now, women in Jewish society didn't have a lot going for them. In fact, they had 2 things against them. Number 1, women were not considered reliable witnesses. Sorry, ladies. But in Jewish society, women were not considered reliable witnesses. In fact, their testimony would not uphold in court in Jewish culture, especially during Jesus' day, because it wasn't considered reliable, just because of their gender. The second thing that women had going against them in Jewish culture was that they were a low rung on the social ladder. They were considered along the level of dogs and things of that nature. They were not high up on the social ladder. It was not very favorable for women during the days of Christ. Now, that being said, and that being the case, if you are going to make up a story, if you're going to lie about something, and you're going to try and convince someone to believe something, for example, that Jesus Christ rose from the grave, there's one thing you're not going to do. You're not going to make women your earliest and most reliable eyewitness testimonies. And that's exactly what the Gospels do. In the accounts of Matthew and the accounts of John, it is the women who first discover the empty tomb. And it is the women who have to go to the apostles and tell them that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Why would these individuals do this if they're trying to make up this account? The reality is that they wouldn't. They wouldn't do it unless that is exactly what happened. And they're simply recording it. Fifthly and finally, the evidence for the empty tomb is the early Jewish response to the empty tomb. The early Jewish response to the empty tomb. If you turn to Matthew chapter 28, verses 11 through 15, we don't have time to read all of that, but you can simply mark it. Matthew 28, 11 through 15. Matthew is recording an account in which the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, are trying to start a rumor by saying, tell them, this is how they're trying to explain the resurrection, tell them that the disciples, what? That the disciples stole the body from the grave. Okay? So what Matthew is trying to do in his gospel, he is trying to show that this claim has no basis. He's trying to refute a common, widespread explanation from the Jewish population of the resurrection. Now notice the claim. Notice the claim. The disciples stole away the body. Friends, why would the authorities make that claim? They're not going to make that claim unless there is an empty tomb. And Matthew is not going to even bring this up unless it actually happened. Why? Because all it's going to do for Matthew is bring doubt upon his claim that Jesus rose from the grave. He's not going to bring that claim up on his own that they stole the body of Jesus. The only reason that he would bring it up is if the Pharisees were actually making that claim during his time and it actually needed to be refuted, and they wouldn't have made that claim unless the body had been taken and the tomb was empty. And so the early Jewish response showed that there was an empty tomb. So these 5 lines of evidences make a powerful case for the historical reliability of the empty tomb. In fact, New Testament critic, now I want you to notice the last part of what I just said. New Testament critic, a critic of the New Testament, meaning he criticizes the New Testament, not necessarily antagonistically, but to look at the text. Jacob Kremer said this. He said, by far, most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. So I think you should hold that into account. Second line of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ are the resurrection appearances, or what we often refer to as the post-mortem, post-death experiences. And I just want to look at a few lines of evidences underneath that supporting that. Number 1 is Paul's list of eyewitness accounts. Paul's list of eyewitness accounts, you can write this down, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 3 through 8, Paul writes to the Corinthians, and he's talking about a list of individuals that Jesus appeared to. And in that list, he talks about Peter, he talks about the 12, and then he says, just kind of nonchalantly, and he says he appeared to over 500 brethren at one time, most of whom, he says, are still alive with us today. Now, we probably have just kind of skipped over that. We've not thought much about it when reading it. But there is apologetic significance to what Paul is writing there. Number 1, and the main reason being, why would Paul make this claim if all these brethren had to do was check and see if it was true? Meaning, if this is not true, why would Paul say, hey, I've got 500 witnesses to this, and all they had to go is check with these people and say, no, you don't. They're, like you said, they're still alive. Or they could say, well, they're dead. Actually, Paul, you're lying to us. He's not going to make that claim unless he knows for a fact that what he is saying will be confirmed by these people. Because otherwise it would be pointless. He talks about the appearance of James. We don't have time to go into this. But the conversion of James, and he says, least of all to me, The conversion of Paul presents a problem for individuals who want to deny the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because Paul is a historically undeniable figure who claims to have killed and persecuted Christians, which he wouldn't claim that about himself unless it was true, because it doesn't present him as historically good anyways. And so he says that he persecuted Christians, and then all of a sudden he has this huge turnaround in which he is now proclaiming the faith which he once persecuted. The life of Paul itself is a historical verification of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because he saw and knew Jesus Christ, and he was proclaiming this faith. So this list of eyewitnesses verifies that there were these resurrection appearances that could be verified by a host of individuals. Otherwise, it could have easily been debunked by the people that Paul was writing to in 1 Corinthians. Next, we have, in support of the resurrection appearances, the independent gospel accounts. The independent gospel accounts. There are multiple independent reports of post-mortem appearances, of resurrection appearances. I'm just going to list these real quickly. I know that you don't have time to write them down, but we're running out of time. So these independent reports are, number one, to Peter by Paul and Luke. That is, Jesus appeared to Peter, and Paul and Luke record this in 1 Corinthians 15:5, Luke 24 and 34. Jesus appeared to the 12. That's recorded by Paul, Luke, and John. Appearance to the women disciples. That's recorded by Matthew and John. To the disciples in Galilee, that's recorded by Matthew, Mark, and John. Now, remember, these are various historical documents that make independent claims of resurrection appearances that don't have to do with each other. These are all separate appearances. So the question is, were these individuals simply hallucinating? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Or are they, in fact, true? Skeptical critic Gerd Lüdemann, would by no means be considered a conservative Christian of any kind. He said this. He said, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. I want you to listen to that. Historically certain. This is an individual who is a skeptic, who recognizes that there is no denying. He would say that there's no denying that they claim to have seen him. He wouldn't say that he actually saw him, but he's saying there's no denying that they actually believe that they saw him. And we'll talk about the other a little bit later. And then thirdly, we won't spend any time on this really, but the bodily resurrection of the appearances. You have to realize that the claims that the New Testament makes is not that they saw Jesus in a dream. It's not that they saw the Spirit of Jesus. They knew what ghosts were like. They weren't dumb in the first century. They knew what a ghost was. And they weren't claiming that Jesus was a ghost. They weren't claiming that he was a dream. They were claiming that they saw him, that they touched him, that they ate breakfast with him, that they were with him. Those are the claims that they are making. All right, let's move on to the third line of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that is the origin of the Christian faith. The origin of the Christian faith. What caused this whole Christian thing to start up and begin? Why did it even start? Well, skeptical scholars would concede that the origin of the Christian faith was based on the early Christian belief that they witnessed the resurrected Jesus. That's what it was based on. Now, this doesn't make much sense, and that's the problem. It doesn't make much sense when you view how the Jews viewed the Messiah. Because what the disciples are claiming about Jesus and what they're believing about Jesus, it is nothing like what they actually believed about the Messiah beforehand. I want you to read a real quick excerpt from William Lane Craig in his book. I'm lazy and I didn't type it out. I just brought the book up here. But it says this. He says, Jews had no conception of a Messiah. I want you to listen to this carefully. Jews had no conception of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Messiah was supposed to be a triumphant figure who would command the respect of Jew and Gentile alike, who would establish the throne of David in Jerusalem. A Messiah who failed to deliver and to reign, who was defeated, humiliated, and slain by his enemies, is a contradiction in terms. Nowhere do Jewish texts speak of a Messiah, of such a Messiah. Therefore, it's difficult to overemphasize what a disaster the crucifixion was for the disciples' faith. Jesus' death on the cross spelled the humiliating end for any hopes that they had entertained that he was a Messiah. That is, that there was no concept of a crucified, risen Messiah within the Old Testament text from the interpretation of Jesus' day. And so now they're claiming a Messiah that really they have no historical basis for in their minds. Meaning that shows the truthfulness of the claim, because this is not something they would have made up. This is not something that they would have believed. And so these lines of evidences, the origin of the Christian faith, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to go over a little bit this evening, but this is important. So that's evidence: the empty tomb, the resurrection appearances, the origin of the Christian faith. The fact that this faith originated out of something that it really shouldn't have happened. They really should not be claiming Jesus as the Messiah because there's no basis for it. Now the question is, what is the best explanation for that evidence? What is the best explanation for that evidence? Well, there's a variety of different things that are given for the explanation of that evidence. Number one, individuals might say it was a conspiracy. That is, the disciples stole the body of Jesus and they lied about his resurrection. But there's issues with that. There's issues with that claim. If they stole the body, why would they choose women as their earliest eyewitness accounts? We talked about that. And secondly, you have to again explain the belief of the apostles, because as we see within the New Testament, the disciples didn't have a semblance of belief. They actually believed that they saw Jesus rose from the grave. So how do you explain that belief? And these disciples endured horrific deaths. These claims that they were making did not elevate them within the social status. It did not make them more favorable politically. It did not gain them riches or wealth. In fact, it led many of them to go towards horrendous death. Peter, if historically accurately recorded, was crucified upside down. Why die for what you know? Now notice, why die for what you know is a lie? Geisler and Turek have a great quote. They said, "Many will die for a lie that they believe is the truth, but no one dies for what they know is a lie." No one dies for what they know is a lie. And again, the concept of this Jewish Messiah, of a Jewish Messiah who was crucified, was resurrected, was not within the Jewish belief. I love this. N.T. Wright said this. He said, it's kind of comical actually. He says, if you're a first century Jew, and your favorite Messiah got himself crucified, then you basically have two choices. You go home or you find a new Messiah. Those are the only two options you have. If your Messiah that you've invested in has been crucified, you either go home or find a new Messiah. But all of a sudden, these Jewish men start proclaiming that this man who was killed is the Son of God. And so, also the fact that the Jewish belief of the resurrection, this did not coincide with the Jewish belief of the resurrection. The Jews did not believe that one man would be resurrected before the rest. They did believe in a general resurrection at the end of time, but they did not believe in one man being resurrected from the dead. And so all of a sudden you have these 12 highly Jewish men claiming a belief that has no basis within their scriptures, at least from the way that they interpreted it. And so why would they start doing that? Why, by the way, would these Jewish men start worshiping on Sunday instead of the Sabbath, even though they've been raised that if you violate the Sabbath, you'll be stoned and killed? Why would they do that? Because something happened. Something happened. There's a lot of other things that we could discuss. The apparent death hypothesis that Jesus, for example, didn't really die on the cross, and he just barely survived, and they brought him back and resuscitated him. Just a couple of things. Number one, the Romans didn't let anyone get away from crucifixion without killing them. And number two, an emaciated, almost dead man is not going to inspire 12 men or 11 men to believe that he was the resurrected Son of God. And they definitely wouldn't believe that he rose from the grave. They just think that he barely got by. It doesn't add up. Or the idea that there were mass hallucinations among the apostles. Do you realize there's no such thing as a mass hallucination? There's no such thing. That was popular a while back for people to say, well, all the apostles just had mass hallucinations. The problem is that there is absolutely no such thing historically or scientifically verifiable as a mass hallucination. There's no such thing. And so, any post-death vision in the first century Jewish context would have been in a glorified state of heaven. That is, they would have believed that he was a spirit, not the resurrected Son of God, but that's not what they're claiming. They're claiming that he was resurrected bodily and fully. So, after going through all of these explanations for the evidence that we see in history, we can verifiably absolutely say that the best explanation for the evidence that we see within history is that Jesus of Nazareth actually rose from the grave. Now, why is that impossible? The only reason that would be impossible is if you deny the fact that there is a God, which we've already shown in previous lessons that there is evidence for that. If you concede that there is a God who created this world, who is immensely powerful, who is immensely wise, that it is absolutely possible that Jesus Christ rose from the grave. Well, what does that mean for your life, though, tonight? What it means is that this man who they have rejected, as Peter tells them in Acts chapter 2, verses 36, that God has made him both Lord and Christ. That he is not simply a risen man from the dead, he is the ascended Lord of creation. And you can bow to him now and submit to him now, or you will bow your knee later, but eventually you will submit to him. He loves you, he longs for you to be with him, and he wants to one day resurrect you from the dead, just as he was resurrected from the dead, to live with him for eternity in God's pleasure and goodness. Why don't you place your faith in him, repent of your sins, confess him, be baptized for the remission of your sins, or respond to the gospel this evening. Whatever your need is, come forward as together we stand and as we sing.